These are all triangular scarves. One defined 2017, one was released last fall, and one has been knit over 50,000 times. Now, I've spent more time than I'd like to admit thinking about this shape, because for about a decade, it was the thing in the knitting world until people just kind of stopped making them. But suddenly, this shape is everywhere again. Only this time, it feels different. Same shape, different energy. Over the course of a decade, the triangular shawl went from cool to dated to chic again. So what happened? For one brief, beautiful moment in history, scarves weren't just an accessory, they made your outfit. From giant blanket scarves to smaller scarves covered in quirky animal prints, a carefully styled scarf, combined maybe with a felt brim hat, felt like almost a necessary addition to your outfit before leaving the house. And the knitting world drank up that energy. Because for the first, and maybe the only time in recent history, the Venn diagram between peak mainstream fashion and thing every knitter, even a beginner, could confidently make overlapped perfectly. Knitters responded quickly. Between 2009 and 2012, triangular shawls exploded across Ravelry. Ishbel, Damson, Haruni, Traveling Woman, triangular shawls were the thing in the knitting world. Shawl designers weren't just experiencing success in this time period, they were becoming veritable knitting celebrities. So if you were knitting between 2009 and 2017, it really felt like triangular shawls were everywhere. And for good reason, they're kind of the perfect knitting project. They range from super simple and beginner-friendly to advanced lace techniques that might take months to finish, but you don't have to worry about fit issues or shaping. You'll never have to worry about bust or waist in a shawl. They're one size fits all. They're super portable and easy to throw in your bag, and for the most part, relative to a sweater, they don't use that much yarn. But shawls also unlocked experimentation, because at the same time that hand-knitted shawls were booming in popularity, the hand-dyed yarn industry was growing too. This world encouraged bold colors, speckles, variegation, fades, and ombres. So if you're not quite willing to experiment on a whole sweater made out of neon green and pink speckled yarn, maybe you'd be willing to play around with it in a shawl. In a lot of ways, the hand-dyed yarn industry fed the popularity of the shawl, just as the popularity of the shawl fed the hand-dyed yarn industry. They weren't two separate things. They were a symbiotic ecosystem. Maybe this is most evident in the trending patterns around 2017, 2018, when ombre hand-dyed yarn kits were at kind of peak popularity, and alongside them we see Andrea Mowry's Find Your Fade shawl. But maybe most importantly, shawls just felt cool. In a hipster-driven fashion world where handmade felt aspirational, knitting your own shawl felt like kind of the coolest thing you could do. Maybe second only to having a mustache finger tattoo. Shawl knitting wasn't just popular. The entire knitting world seemed to revolve around it, from indie dyers to festivals to pattern design. If you were knitting in 2016, it would have felt inconceivable that all of this would fade away, which raises an inevitable question: what happened? Because by somewhere around 2023, shawls were not the center of the knitting world anymore. Sweaters were. Clean lines, oatmeal-colored top-down raglans, mohair held double. Suddenly, the aspiration looked very different. And to understand why that happened, we'll have to leave knitting for a minute, because fashion changed first. Somewhere around the 2010s, fashion started simplifying. Athleisure was everywhere, minimalism was the word of the day, and instead of the over-layered maximalist outfits we saw flooding Tumblr in the early 2000s, now we're seeing clean lines and simplicity. And scarves were no longer the centerpiece of an outfit. People still wore them, but they just went back to being scarves, just something you wore around your neck because you were cold. They weren't the focal point of every outfit. Suddenly, a giant speckled neon ombre scarf began feeling a little bit off. What had aligned perfectly with hipster fashion just a few years prior started to feel disconnected from what was popular in the mainstream. Now, a quick caveat: if you love and knit shawls like I do, you probably continued to wear and even knit shawls even after this fashion shift had happened. I'm not saying that shawls are unwearable or even uncool, but what I am saying is the focus of the knitting world started to shift away from shawls in a very noticeable way. And the fact that the knitting world stepped away from shawls at almost the exact same moment mainstream fashion did is actually kind of strange. Because up until this point in history, following mainstream fashion hadn't been a priority of the knitting world. In the early to mid-2000s, the knitting world was defined by how skillfully or creatively you could make something that felt unique. Whether that was a new way to combine colors or a new way to approach garment construction, knitters were delighted by surprising other knitters by the really clever ways that they could achieve something. The vast majority of sweaters you saw walking around Rhinebeck did not look store-bought. It wasn't the point of the craft. But then Instagram came along, and it started rewarding a very different type of aesthetic. Earlier knitting culture rewarded color, personality, experimentation, uniqueness. But now, knitting culture was rewarding clean lines, minimalism, neutral color palettes. Designers weren't trying to break the mold, they were trying to fit inside of it, and the new aspiration had become, would someone assume I bought this at a really expensive mall? I think part of the reason why so many knitters have gravitated toward neutral, wearable basics is because putting together a cohesive outfit with a hand knit can feel like a challenge. It's something that I struggle with a lot myself, and that's why I love Quince, the sponsor of today's video. They make wearable, polished basics out of natural fibers that I can reach for and pair with my hand knits seamlessly. They seem to elevate every hand knit I make into a really beautiful outfit. I feel confident knowing if I have to take my sweater off because I get too hot, I have a beautiful piece underneath that looks really polished and pulled together. As a knitter, I think a little bit more than the average consumer about materials and sourcing, and that's another reason I feel so good about wearing Quince. They partner directly with the manufacturer to make sure they can guarantee sustainable and ethical sourcing of their goods. And because they're working directly with the factory, they can give you a little bit of a break on the price. So you're getting Mongolian cashmere and mulberry silk without the traditional retail markup. If you're like me and you've been struggling to build a wardrobe that complements your hand knits instead of competing with them out of natural fibers with sustainable and ethical sourcing, I highly recommend Quince. I'll put a link in the description down below and a QR code on screen that gives you free shipping and 365-day returns. And thank you again to Quince for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to shawls. Around 2020, that shift toward wearable basics sweeps through the knitting world and sweaters take over. And petite knit pretty quickly becomes the poster child of this new aesthetic. Suddenly people are no longer clamoring for fade kits and speckles. People are reaching for neutrals and monotone palettes. And even designers who helped define the shawl era shifted too. Ysolda Teague, whose classics, Ishbel and Damson, were designs that helped push shawl popularity forward, changed the way that they were designing. Ysolda designed shawls up until 2018 and then just stopped. Ysolda's biggest recent hit is the Musselburgh hat, a clean, polished, wearable design that feels completely at home in this new aesthetic. Now, triangular shawls didn't disappear completely. Many knitters, myself included, continued to love and knit them, but they stopped being a keystone of the knitting world in the way that they once were, which makes what happens next kind of interesting. Around the same time that petite knit is rising to popularity, 2019 to 2020, celebrities start picking up triangular scarves again. Jennifer Lawrence is photographed wearing them. A$AP Rocky coins the term babushka boy. Fashion people started revisiting the triangular scarf, but this time it was in a much quieter register, smaller, more intentional, chic, and it doesn't take knitters very long to notice. In 2022, Petite Knit releases the Sophie Scarf. Now, it's not a triangular shawl, but it is that familiar triangular shape. And just like we're seeing in the celebrity fashion world, it's more restrained, it's smaller, calmer, intentionally styled. It falls somewhere in between the triangular shawl of the knitting world and the smaller triangle that celebrities are embracing, and the knitting world loses their mind over it. 4 years later, the Sophie Scarf has been knit over 50,000 times, and that's just based on Ravelry metrics alone. The real number is almost certainly higher. Looking back, I think the Sophie Scarf is one of our first indicators that the triangular shawl may be making a comeback. It just has an entirely new energy. For a few years, triangles continue to float around the celebrity scene, tiny chic triangles styled as babushkas or tied around the neck. And somewhere around 2024 and 2025, the shape starts showing up everywhere. The Row, Totem, Sandy Lang. We see celebrities like Zoe Kravitz embracing the shape. Suddenly triangles start feeling really chic and aspirational. But there's a catch. Because celebrity fashion did not revive the dramatic, oversized blanket scarf, they revived something with a very different flavor. Something subdued, minimalist, and quiet. and knitters picked up on that too. Which brings me to the moment that really convinced me that the triangular shawl is coming back to the knitting world. In 2018, Ysolda designs one final shawl pattern and stops until November 2025, when we see the release of the Mae shawl. Aesthetically, this feels like a completely different era, and it's much more aligned with ready-to-wear fashion than Ysolda's previous designs were 15 years ago. Even the description of the design says that Ysolda was inspired by commercial knitwear. Now, I'm not surprised that Ysolda uses very clever construction to make this shawl. It still looks like something that would be super delightful to knit and would teach new skills. I would expect nothing less from Ysolda. But the energy, the vibe, is very different than shawls used to be. So the same designer who helped define the shawl boom that happened 10 to 15 years ago comes back with a new shawl design, completely aligned with the modern aesthetic language of the knitting world. Ishbel says, "Did you make that?" And Mae says, "Where did you buy that?" So I'm starting to think this is really happening. We should expect to see a proliferation of simple, wearable stockinette shawl patterns in the knitting world. Because as we see Vogue and fashion bloggers write more and more about how the triangular shawl is the garment of the season, and especially because the modern knitter is so focused on wearable basics, when we see a simple, wearable shape enter mainstream fashion and it's easy to translate onto hand knitting, knitters are bound to pick it up. And when it comes to shawl knitting, we accidentally spent the last 5 years building the perfect ecosystem for this comeback, because an entirely new class of knitters picked up the craft during 2020 lockdown. They were knitting lots of top-down, seamless, oatmeal-colored raglan sweaters, maybe even a drawer full. And eventually, you're going to want to try knitting something different, but not too different, because if you've been knitting top-down seamless raglan sweaters, your skill set is still limited to the skills needed to make that garment. Jumping into something different might feel wildly intimidating, but a triangular shawl, which only uses 1 or 2 skeins of yarn, maybe the ones you have hanging around left over from a finished sweater project, it only uses stitches that you will have had to learn and master for your sweater projects. It's not a giant leap, but it's different enough to feel exciting while still being familiar enough to be approachable. I think it's the perfect next step for an entire class of knitters who learned the craft at the exact same time. I don't think we're ever going to return to the find your fade era, but I do think we're about to enter a second triangular shawl phase of knitting. I just think it's going to look like this. And I think it's going to be everywhere. Honestly, I think we're still early, but I'm expecting to see a lot of triangular shawl patterns flooding Ravelry this upcoming fall and winter. So now I'm curious, if you're a shawl knitter at heart like me, how do you feel about the return of the triangle? And if you're a newer knitter, is shawl knitting something that you'd be curious to try? Because if you're interested, I would love to put a little tutorial together for you and help bring you over to the shawl side. If you made it this far, you can hit the subscribe and the like to let me know you enjoyed this video. And if you want to keep in touch in between videos, you can follow me over on Instagram and TikTok or support me on Patreon. As always, it's been so nice to talk about knitting with you today, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye!